It's great to welcome back to the program Harry Segal, who is a clinical psychologist and senior lecturer in the psychology department at Cornell University. It's so great to have you on. And we were, chatting a little bit before we started here that we last spoke to you before President Biden decided to step aside and not continue his reelection campaign. Very much in retrospect, I feel that it was the right decision. A couple of different reasons why I feel that way, but I want to hear from you in terms of the way you look at these candidates and fitness and ability. Do you think it was a necessary thing for him to do? Do you think it was the right thing for him to do?
I think it was certainly the right thing to do politically because, when we last spoke, I was really following my colleague John Gartner's idea that Trump had a brain that was dementing, as he would put it, and Biden had a brain that was aging. And I think what we saw in that disastrous debate was Biden having a difficult time. And when people are in their 80s and they're working very, very hard, and it's at night, that he got lost a number of times, and it was confirming everyone's fear that he was too old. Now, I happen to think that afterwards, when he hosted NATO and he had that extraordinary press conference that went on for an hour, and at rallies, he was showing that he still had the mental fitness to do the work and to do the job. But I think he really lost the confidence of the public.
Mm.
He lost the confidence of the party. And I think that, uh, what I was about to say is, I don't think he was ever a good candidate.
Mm.
I think he was an excellent president, but I don't think he was ever a good candidate. And David, I remember reading an article about him in 1988 in Esquire when I first heard his story about the death of his wife and his two boys. Um, and I remember thinking this could be a really interesting president, but remember that campaign didn't go well either. So I think for all those reasons, but both I think clearly he has periods, perhaps during the day, where he's not able to function as well. A friend of mine who's a clinician has a patient who's 86, who was a former professor at Cornell, and what this man tells my friend is that at 86 he has about 4 good hours a day
Mm.
where he can really focus, and otherwise he's kind of puttering around. And maybe we saw that kind of decline with Biden, but I don't think that his decline at all resembles what we were seeing with Trump.
So let's talk about that. We now have 60-year-old Kamala Harris and we have 78-year-old Donald Trump.
Hmm.
It is my view that not enough attention has been paid for a long time to what Donald Trump is experiencing, whatever it is. And I say that as a layperson and not an expert. I recently reviewed video of Donald Trump in 2016, 2020, and 2024. And although I don't necessarily have the clinical vocabulary to describe everything I'm observing something extraordinarily notable here. So as you now, what are the most precise terms with which you can describe what you're now observing in Trump?
Well, there's a number of things that are noticeable, and I'm so glad you went back and looked at those, because not only does he look different in 2024, but I would argue he looks different than he looked in July.
Yes.
I'm seeing some real decline, and unfortunately, with these kinds of disease processes, they often speed up. But before I even comment on those, let me just state at the outset that his bravado, his confidence, his ability to connect to his audience and to feed off of the adulation is still very much intact.
Yes.
And if he's interviewed by a very friendly room, the Fox and Friends Saturday team, for example, who interviewed him last June and believed all of the myths about Trump, he can come across fairly coherent. He still wanders, but if he's comfortable and it's during the day and there's adoring people, that bravado and that confidence persists.
Yes.
What has been slipping, however, is when he is pressed to answer complicated questions, he cannot answer them.
Right.
He will digress, he will stonewall, he will tread water, but he's really avoiding anyone asking him difficult questions, as we saw at the Detroit Economic Club, and we also saw at the New York Club. So specifically what I'm seeing is this. First of all, there's an increase in the phonemic paraphasias. That is his inability to finish certain words when he begins them. And like many people who struggle with early signs of dementia, he will try to cover it up by rushing to another word.
Yes.
So I've seen that increasing. What we're also seeing, I think, is a kind of simplifying of his sentences. So he gums together these ideas and says them. And some of them we notice, like the Hannibal Lecter thing. And then when he hears the criticisms, he says that they're part of his genius.
So let's talk about that a little before we I want to talk about that because this is a bigger topic. And I mentioned this to you also before we started. One of the things I'm noticing is that Donald Trump is clearly aware of what's being said about his cognition. And he started to develop some tools to react to that. One of the tools is that he regularly says Kamala Harris needs a cognitive test. Something's wrong with her brain. She's low IQ, etc. Anybody who honestly evaluates her knows that this is very much not the case. It's so obvious that this isn't the case, but it's interesting that as the focus has shifted to Trump's brain, he starts talking about Kamala Harris. The other thing I've noticed is the so-called weave. And I think this is what you're pointing to, which is recognizing that he often doesn't answer the question or can't or doesn't want to or ends up on tangential topics. He has couched this as he has an incredible linguistic and communication ability to weave together seemingly unrelated topics and always come back to the original question. Once again, anyone who looks at his speeches knows that that's not what's happening, but talk about that. It is in a sense a protective shield that he has created.
Yes, he rationalizes his deficits by proclaiming either the other person has those deficits, not he, and also he will also attribute it to brilliance.
Yes.
So I remember I think it was in June that he first started talking about how brilliant he was with the we. And he was running three stories together. It was actually about Macron saying that he would put a tariff on things and Trump threatening, one of those Sir stories.
Yes.
And he kept returning to it, but not finishing it. So then he was aware of that and said, I'm just being brilliant. That weave is becoming more and more disorganized. So now when it's happening, he actually never gets back to where he was. And it's very disturbing to see. And as far as his projecting onto Kamala Harris his own deficits, there's something that John Heilman said that I always remember, which is everything Trump says is confession or projection.
Right.
And this is an example of it. And I guess I want to say one more thing, which is not only does Trump suffer from a very severe personality disorder, malignant narcissism with sociopathic features, he's also, of course, having this cognitive decline. I think Kamala Harris has shown herself to be psychologically very healthy.
How can you notice that from what you see on TV or videos?
Well, it's kind of fascinating. I don't know if you watched the town hall with Anderson Cooper.
Yes.
but Cooper was pushing her on a couple things. First of all, on I heard you called your minister when you heard from President Biden that he was dropping out. Can you tell us about that call? And when Harris is asked to talk about something personal, you see her wait a little bit. And then she tells it, and her face kind of lights up. And there's both a vulnerability and a pleasure
Hmm.
in speaking about it. And she did that in talking about her faith and about her church. And then when a woman asked her a question, and Cooper said that this woman's husband had died a year earlier, Cooper went back and said to her, "What about your grieving? I know you lost your mother some time ago." And Harris began to talk about grief in a very personal way.
Hmm.
That when you're grieving someone, you're always aware of the lack of their being gone, but there's an effort to remember them in the way that they wish to be remembered.
Hmm.
And then she went on to say that it's very important for us to allow people to grieve in the way they're going to grieve. And it was so serious and it was so honest. And that ability to talk about difficult things, personal feelings, to be able to talk about it honestly and fluidly is one sign of psychological health.
The other thing that's there that might be relevant is Trump struggles to talk about abstract concepts and ideas, is one thing I notice. Where with
Yes.
Trump, it's, I said this to Mexico, and then, I showed Abdul a picture of his house, and it's a sequential linear narrative about facts. Whereas what you're talking about with Kamala Harris is the idea to talk about a concept in a way that is not relevant to a sequential story. Trump seems to suffer from sort of like concrete thinking is where he hits a limit. Is there some, I don't know if I'm expressing this
No,
articulately, but
no, David, that's so insightful because you're right that when there's cognitive decline, there's the loss of the capacity to think abstractly.
mm,
And Trump he uses formulas now. There's this Sir Story formula. Someone tells him he's going to do something costs too much. Trump threatens the person, like Abdul in the house, and then the person backs off.
yeah.
And then Trump has made himself into the hero in his story. I don't, if you watched Harris's speech at the Ellipse the other night,
Yes.
there's this very beautiful part at the end that I don't think commentators talked about, which she said, I forget the exact expression, but she says, um, I am living the promise of America. I see the promise of America in all of you. Now, that's a poetic, abstract idea that she was able to bring in to create a kind of crescendo at the end of her speech. And yes, it's written and it's on the teleprompter, but she works on her speeches. She's not just reading things. And that,
Last thing, sorry, go ahead. Yeah.
no, I just want to affirm what you said, how different that is.
It's notably different. And this sort of gets me to the last thing I wanted to ask you about, which is the linguistic versus the cognitive. We reported earlier this week on a study that looked at non-teleprompter speaking, right? Because as you point out, the teleprompt, you're reading something, it's not necessarily reflective of vocabulary or spontaneous thought. But it evaluated Donald Trump, Joe Biden, Kamala Harris in debate speech over periods of time. And what
Interesting.
it found was that Kamala Harris's, it looked at 7 different factors, including vocabulary, sentence structure, complexity, all these different things. Kamala Harris essentially unchanged. Joe Biden, yes, some decline. And Donald Trump, notably more decline,
Yes.
linguistically. Here's my question to you.
Oh, yes.
Is it plausible that one might have linguistic decline that does not correlate with cognitive decline, or are in most cases the two related? And I know my audience wrote to me and said, David, there are examples where specific injuries or conditions can affect speech but not cognition, but they're rare. Usually these things
Mm.
go hand in hand. Is that true?
Yes, absolutely. Linguistic performance and behavior is key to looking at cognitive health. In fact, if you look at the IQ, right, the higher the IQ, the greater the person's capacity to think abstractly.
Mm.
So if you have, unfortunately, a low IQ, then you might be only able to think concretely. Like, this is this, this is this, this is good, this is bad. And what you're seeing with Trump off teleprompter, that's exactly right. He still has the bravado and the energy. In fact, he has more energy when he goes off the teleprompter, but his language gets much more simple.
Mm.
And that's what really disturbs me. Last time I was on, you asked me, would I be saying this about a Democrat? Even though I do think Trump is a terrible danger to the world and to our democracy. But if Kamala Harris were showing these signs, I'd be saying the same thing.
Mm.
And
We
I
have been
was.
speaking here with Harry Segal,
Oh,
clinical psychologist, senior lecturer in the psychology department at Cornell University. Really appreciate your insights today and over the last period of time, and we will all be watching next week.
we will. Thanks so much for having me, David.